But did you know that silence has a sound? This song isn't just being ironic or poetic by juxtaposing two competing ideas. Silence doesn't actually exist, at least if there are ears to hear it. You've probably heard the old Zen koan that asks that if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a noise? Well, here's the answer to that riddle. It doesn't. The falling tree doesn't make a noise because there is no one there to hear it. The falling tree creates a sound wave, but it only exists as a wave until it reaches a mechanism to process it as sound. If a camera were present, the recorder would catch the sound wave. If a person were there, the ear would capture the wave and would experience it as the noise created by the crashing tree. At least that's the way my physics prof in university explained it. I'm guessing some of you engineers, and we have one or two of them in the house, that may be able to explain it a little better than I can. And American composer John Cage, who used silence extensively in his work, most notably in his piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where in 3 movements, each one of them are marked tacit, which means be silent. And the musician, and this piece can be played on any instrument, but is usually performed on piano, gets into position and then hold it. I've played it on my trombone a couple of times. The audience or listeners are left to consider the ambient sounds around them and find music in everyday sounds because the musician isn't making any noise. At first glance or initial listening, this piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, seems too clever by half. When I was studying music composition as an undergrad, and I studied Cage's music more thoroughly, it felt like he was playing with the listener, mocking his or her aesthetic expectations, losing people in academic exercise that lived inside his head, rather than engaging his listeners' ears. This wasn't music. It was an exercise in listening, to be sure, but it wasn't music. He wanted to capture music in silence and tell us what he had heard. And so he did this. Cage says this, he says, "Going into an anechoic chamber at Harvard University, I expected to hear no sound at all because it was a room made silent as possible. But in that room, I heard 2 sounds, and I was so surprised that I went to the engineer in charge and said, 'There's something wrong. There's 2 sounds in that room.' And he said, 'Describe them.' And I did. One was a high and one was low. And then he said, 'The high one was my nervous system, and the low one was my blood circulating.' So I realized I was making music unintentionally, continuously." Kind of a loose definition of music, don't you think? Although Cage might not want to trust his lying ears, because one commentator says this, he says, "It is possible to call into question the strict factuality of the comments attributed to the engineer." Peter Gina, who says in a John Cage reader, has confirmed with several doctors that no one can hear the operation of his or her own nervous system. The circulation of one's own blood remains inaudible unless there is some incipient cardiovascular blockage. Possibly Cage was hearing tinnitus or ringing in the ears. Because no matter what he heard, it wasn't silence, at least as it's usually defined. Silence being the absence of sound. And many people approach silence differently. Everyone has their own relationship with silence. When I began my ministry and started doing visitations to shut-ins, I noticed a pattern emerge. I noticed that every home I visited had the TV on when I arrived. And it wasn't something that the person wasn't necessarily watching. I didn't catch them watching their soaps or The Price is Right or even CNN. They usually had the channel turned to either the Weather Channel or, that Rogers network that has infomercials while the news is running underneath. I figured it was just, an old person's thing. They liked keeping up with the news and the weather during the day. But then I found myself living alone. And I found myself with the TV on most of the time when I was awake, and often while I was asleep. because I found the silence difficult. It wasn't welcome. It reminded me that I was alone. And the talking heads on the TV was at least some kind of human interaction. And I realized that those shut-ins were doing the same thing. But while I usually had Sportsnet or TSN instead of the Weather Channel, the effect was the same. I wasn't really listening to the content, it was just noise. We were using the TV to drown the silence that reminded us that we were alone, just to hear another human's voice. In many religious traditions and spiritual practices, a romanticism surrounds silence. Silent retreats have become popular in recent years. Many spiritual and religious teachers emphasize listening in silence or meditating, calming or silencing the inner voice. But I think you have to come from a specific place in life for that kind of silence to be valuable. If you're surrounded by uninvited silence all day, like some shut-ins are, that type of spiritual practice might serve to do more harm than bring enlightenment or spiritual maturity. But I also know that for many of you, silence is an oasis, a calm from the tempests that swirl within your life. It's a moment of rest where your shell-shocked spirit can soak in serenity because there's so much spinning around you and your mind doesn't easily turn to quiet. And so you stop and you listen, hoping to hear nothing. Wherever you find yourself, everyone approaches silence from their own place in life. Just ask the prophet Elijah. He was under attack. Jezebel's army was chasing him because he slaughtered all her priests, the priests of the pagan god Baal, after winning a contest of strength with the God of Israel, winning handily. Elijah in victory then slaughtered the priests of Baal. And so Queen Jezebel wanted Elijah dead too. And so he escapes to Judah, where he falls asleep under a tree after asking God to take his life. He's alone, he's in danger, and he can't see a way out. But an angel wakes him, gives him something to eat, then sends him on a 40-day, 40-night journey to Horeb, the place where so many years ago Moses received the 10 Commandments. And Elijah is bitter. Upon arrival in Horeb, he retreats to a cave where he complains to God that he is the only one left that is faithful. And Elijah is then told to stand on the edge of the cave, for the Lord is about to pass by. And if you were in his place, what would you expect if you were told that you were about to see God with your own eyes? I'm guessing that, like Elijah, you would look for God in the strength of the great wind, a wind so strong that it split mountains, a wind so powerful that it could crush your enemies, lay waste to all that is hateful and unholy, and extinguish all injustice and cruelty. But you'd be wrong. The Lord was not in the wind. Or maybe you try to see God in a devastating earthquake, an earthquake that split the earth in half, breaking kingdoms that threaten to destroy what God has lovingly created. Again, you'd be wrong. The Lord was not in the earthquake. Or it must be the fire, like the burning bush that Moses saw that gave him his mission to lead God's people to freedom. Or the refining fire that David sang about, a fire that burned off all impurities and made people holy once again. But no, that wasn't it at all. The Lord was not in the fire. Then the clouds covered the cave and swaddled Elijah. And so Elijah wrapped his face so as not to look directly into the eyes of the Almighty. Then all he heard was sheer silence. A silence so cavernous and so expansive that it covered his whole being, enveloping him in the swath of its gestating warmth. And then the silence asked him, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah answered, "I am the only one left. Everyone else has betrayed God. There is no one else who has kept this relationship with you. I am all alone because they want to kill me." "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I have come to talk with you again. Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping. And the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence." This song reverberates with the silence that Elijah heard. It's a silence that is felt in the bones. A silence that reminds him that he is alone. A silence so full-bodied he can speak to it. Like the darkness, his old friend, the darkness, the absence of light, the absence of hope, the absence of vision is a messenger to tell him that, yes, he has lost his way. The familiar darkness, like the silence, speaks to him more truthfully than light or sound could, because it is in the darkness and in the silence that he feels the vulnerability of being totally alone. And the silence asks him the most difficult question that has ever reached his ears. What are you doing here? Why are you in this place? How did you get here? Well, it was God's call that brought him here. He was just doing what he was told. However, in restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone. 'Neath the halo of a street lamp, I turned my collar to the cold and damp. When my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. This darkness was stabbed by this neon light, a light born, not born from the sun. It is a human light that is trying to shine its way out of the darkness it found itself in. And Elijah looks around, and even in the darkness, he knows where he is, because he remembers the history of that mountain, Mount Horeb. He remembered that his people were both free and they were lost. "Why are you here?" the silence asked. "Because I'm looking for freedom," he answers. And in the naked light, I saw 10,000 people, maybe more. People talking without speaking. People hearing without listening. People writing songs that voices never share, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Because Elijah remembered that story. He remembered what happened on that mountain. He remembered that after God's people found freedom from captivity in Egypt, they were in chaos. They didn't know how to be free. They couldn't find the words to bring them order. And the silence that they heard was a silence of lies, the absence of truth. The silence that people didn't want to disturb because they knew that then they would be confronted with their own naked emptiness. They remembered Moses seeing the chaos that freedom had created and the silence devoid of order, the delusions of manufactured wisdom, the mistaken belief that all they needed was their freedom in order to make them whole. "So fools," I said, "you do not know. Silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you. Take my arms that I might reach you." But my words, like silent raindrops, fell and echoed in the wells of silence. So Moses went up the mountain and came down with the law, the commandments that would both govern them and give them their identity. It would bring them together as a people, and it would teach them how to be free. However, as he emerged from the mountain, this is what he saw. And the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. And the sign flashed out its warning in the words that it was forming. And the sign said, "The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls and whispered in the sounds of silence." It was no accident that Elijah landed in Horeb. It was at Horeb that Moses received the 10 Commandments. And it was also on the base of that mountain at Horeb that the newly freed Israelites built their golden calf, whom they worshiped in wilderness of God's absence. It was out of the wilderness that the prophets speak, whether the wilderness of the mountain or the muted cries of hidden humanity, whose voices are written in the wilderness that we pass by those whom we do not want to listen. It is a silence that preys on our contrived certainties. And so Elijah hears this. He asks God, where does he go next? And this is the answer he receives. Then the Lord said to Elijah, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." The prophet would speak where the people would hear him. And more prophets would join him and take his message into the future and into other lands. They wouldn't speak the bold proclamations of the priests of Baal because they were gone. But they would speak the whispered sounds of silence of the God of Israel who spoke to Elijah in that cave. Elijah learned that he wasn't alone. He learned that out of the silence came voices he didn't consider. He learned from the silence, as soul-searing as it was, that he wasn't the only one who remained faithful, that God was rising up a people. But Elijah had to return to Horeb to remember who he was. He had to return to the mountain where God created order from chaos. Elijah had to return to the scene where God's wandering desert dwellers finally became a mighty nation bound together by common law, a law filled with God's justice, a law that would teach them how to be free. Because the sound of silence didn't produce singing, it created more attentive listening. For Elijah, he was listening to his life. He was asking, where then was his life taking him? Where was God leading him? Now he could tell. And the question that emerged from the silence is as important to us as it was to him. And maybe it's an important one for you as well here today. Why are you here? That is the question that the silence is asking you today. Why are you here? It's the question that's been asking, especially if you're feeling lost, especially if you're feeling alone, especially if you feel like your life is in chaos, especially if the darkness has become an old friend and you have trouble seeing the way ahead. So you are here at your own Horeb. You want to reconnect with your place in God's story. You want to relearn how to be free. The sound of silence that Elijah heard wasn't a quick pick-me-up. That would have dismissed the very real bewilderment that he was feeling. And that God didn't speak to Elijah in the mighty wind, the terrible earthquake, or the devastating fire, but through sheer silence, respected Elijah's moment of confusion and abandonment. And that's why the silence asked, "Why are you here?" "I am looking for freedom." And God answered that prayer. God showed him that he wasn't alone. God showed him that his life did matter. He fought the gods of Baal, the gods of oppression and injustice, the gods of cruelty and death. And he won a victory for the God of Israel, the God of life. And so Elijah God sent Elijah to continue on that path, to serve the God of life, the God of justice, the God of kindness for the weak, the God of mercy, and the God of love. Because if anything, that God is still speaking, and it is speaking through the sound of silence, because that is not the voice we often hear. Because the God that speaks to you through the silence is telling you the same thing that God told Elijah, that you have fought battles and you have won victories for God, that you are not alone in the fight and you are not alone in the victory. If you have returned to Horeb, hoping to hear a word emerge from the silence, the word speaking to you is this: be kind, be loving, be merciful, give life to others, and speak truth. For those are the words that emerge from the sound of silence. And may this be so among us. Amen.